Growing up with the PS2, I was introduced to a lot of different types of games, like many others who had it. I was introduced to Dragon Quest through my older brother, I was introduced to Kingdom Hearts by my best friend, I got my fill of platforming and third-person shooting from Ratchet and Clank, but I had seen games similar to these before. None of these were brand new concepts for me at that point. That is until Dynasty Warriors 4 was put in front of me. Dynasty Warriors was such an eye-opener for me, man. The large-scale wars where you would choose your favorite characters and charge across these battlefields were so unique at the time. Dynasty Warriors is an adaptation of the Romance of the Three Kingdoms novels, dramatized Chinese history taking place during the Han Dynasty. You take control of whichever officer or lieutenant from whichever kingdom you choose, making your way through their story and eventually claiming victory for your faction. It's popcorn entertainment with very little depth to warrant a real focus on it. My brother and I eventually fell off of the series because of that, and because the story is basically always the same in every game. That entire series is long overdue for some love on this channel, but it'll have to wait for right now. I really do want some way to play the spin-off game, Dynasty Warriors Strike Force, with a couple of friends, because it's a co-op game, it's really fun, but it's stuck on the the Xbox 360 era of consoles, and I don't know if there's any way to set up an emulator or get an actual online connection with that going through Xenia or whatever. So if anybody out there knows anything about that, hit me up. But right now, we have to talk about Wo Long Fallen Dynasty. Similar to the Dynasty Warriors games, the story in Wo Long isn't anything remarkable. The player's created character is more or less thrust into a huge war between the factions we all know and love and this new threat of demonic chi, led by this evil wizard who has no actual goals besides being evil and spreading the ickiness around. The Wei faction is led by Cao Cao and his blue-clad soldiers, the Wu faction is led by Sun Jian and his red family of lieutenants, and the Shu faction is led by the heroic Liu Bei and his green brothers-in-arms. There are some outsider groups like the Walking Jokes, the Yellow Turban, a clan of nomad warriors led by the wizard Zhang Liang, and finally, a group known formally on the Dynasty Warriors wiki as Others, a clan I like to call the Purple Guys, led by Dong Zhuo and the unkillable man himself, Lu Bu. The story is just a bunch of watching these characters fight back evil chi zombies, a hint of interpersonal drama, and an unbelievable amount of grunting and panting.
There he is! Defeat the enemy general, Zhang Liao!
Why are you... If he remains guarded...
That's weird.
I can get a surface level of enjoyment from this story through seeing all these characters that I know from my childhood on screen in the Neo engine, but I can only imagine the agony newcomers must be feeling. I seriously felt bad for my player 2, Nick.
That's how I feel too.
Yep.
He hasn't really played any of these games before, so what was he seeing on screen? A bunch of generic soldiers fighting zombies and preaching about the power of brotherhood and friendship? Pretty much. To be fair, that's what most of the Dynasty Warriors games fell into as well, but it had the advantage of letting players control every one of the lieutenants and generals from all of the factions. It's not much by way of character development or learning about these people, but it's enough for a young child to latch onto and remember. I remember Cao Cao's cold tactical brilliance. Remember Sun Jian's ferocious spirit. Remember Liu Bei's compassionate heart, Dong Zhuo's eye for conquest, the Yellow Turban's knack for being pushovers. Most of the attributes are still represented here, and people who grew up with the characters can pick up on these traits, but for the ones that didn't, the story is generic and boring at first, and by the end, annoying to listen to and exhausting to sit through. But at the end of the day, I doubt that's much of a hot take. If you're interested in Wo Long, it's likely that you're playing it for Team Ninja's new approach to their Souls-like formula. Alright, I know I'm in the minority when I say I'm not a huge fan of Neo. I've tried to get into the first game twice now and always lose steam after about 15 or so hours. And I even gave the second game a shot with Nick to see if it could maybe change my mind. Sadly it didn't, and that's not to say that these games are bad. I know several people that live and die by Neo 2 specifically. My buddy Anthony from Deep Dive Interactive and everyone's favorite boy genius Groof Mike. They've both told me separately that I should play it. And I mean, I like aspects of the combat and crafting builds and the countering of certain big attacks, but they're the definition of games that wear me out. The biggest thing is the amount of loot you have to sift through every 15 minutes or so. I grow so numb after playing hours and hours, finding 6 of the same sword with 1.3% more damage than the others, and they all have 6 incrementally better or worse stats attached to them. I know some people live for that numbers game, but I'm the opposite. I would rather just get a weapon that is better or at least handles differently, where there are very clear weapon trade-offs. I also grew more and more worn out by the amount of combat abilities each weapon has. I think it's great for variety in playthroughs, but for me, it overcomplicates my move pool. Like, I'm the kind of player that likes for every move to have a clear strength and purpose, and I didn't get that from a lot of the attacks I was using. That's a really subjective take coming from someone who lives and dies by Dante's complexity in DMC5, I know, but there's something about the amount in Neo's stances and the moves within those stances for every single weapon that can't help but feel bloated. And by all means, feel free to go down to the comments and tell me how much of a smooth brain I have, but that's just how I feel about Neo anytime I play it. All of this is to say that Wo Long is where they hit the perfect balance with everything Neo 1 and 2 had. It is fat trimming in the best possible way. The two bread and butter mechanics of Wo Long are the basic attack on X or square, and a parry mechanic on the B or circle button that works pretty much as Sekiro's does, only with a bit more of a delay between uses, and these two abilities flow straight into the game's defining mechanic, the spirit gauge. Every enemy, boss, and player in Wo Long has a spirit gauge. Split into 2 halves, this gauge is the fight's momentum, essentially. Landing successful light attacks and parrying will build spirit energy in the player's bar, that blue section that goes to the right. You spend this spirit energy on unleashing things like spirit attacks. Each weapon type has one they all come with, activated with Y or triangle. And higher tier versions of weapons can have 2 additional moves activated by holding the right bumper and pressing the corresponding face button. There are also several types of magic that can be learned and hotkeyed to the right trigger and the 4 face buttons. Spells are great at laying on status effects and damage, but spirit attacks are good at damaging the enemy's spirit gauge. The more gauge you have when you use the spirit attacks, the more damage the enemy's bar takes. And when their bar gets filled up all the way to the left, they're stunned and open to a critical strike. These same rules apply to the player though, as you could imagine, and these spells and spirit attacks can be used to gamble, per se. If you haven't quite filled the gauge yet, but you want to unleash a spell that could really help, you can. But you'll be pushing your own spirit gauge to the left to do so, making it really easy for enemies to topple you over if they get just one hit on you afterwards. The spirit gauge is a really cool mechanic. It makes for a genuinely interesting risk versus reward system for your basic and advanced combat maneuvers, making the player really pay attention to their gauge's status at any given moment. It also requires players to take their defensive options more seriously. If you just spam parry or dodge, then your gauge will bottom out within a few failed parries. You'll gain a decent amount of gauge from successfully parrying moves, and even more by parrying these lethal attacks. Unlike Sekiro though, the parry is the only counter maneuver the player has here. That means no Makiri counters or jump counters. If you see an attack, you can parry it. And I mean it too. Weapons of all kinds can be parried, arrows can be parried, bombs can be parried, lightning bolts can be parried, waves of amorphous fire can be parried. This shit is ridiculous, but consistent, and I appreciate that. With those lethal attacks in particular, nothing feels better than jumping in front of your partner and deflecting a life-ending attack and saving them. Because combat in general is always good, and in moments, amazing. Returning from the Neo games are a decent amount of weapons to utilize, all with only one unique attack string. Yeah, the stances and extra moves from Neo have been dropped, opting for a more streamlined kit for each weapon class. I know a lot of people will find this disappointing, but I was rejoicing. This is what I meant when I said fat trimming. I love how simple the movesets are. Along with having 2 melee weapon slots, 2 ranged weapon slots, each player has 5 magical virtues that they can pump points into to gain magical spells. Wood, fire, earth, metal, and water. On each battlefield, you'll accrue a fortitude rank by killing enemies and finding flag posts and claiming them. I think it boosts your stats across the board, don't quote me on that, but it also allows you to access your higher tiers of magic in that level. Some spells can be cast at level 3 fortitude and can help you get through the early parts of the level. Meanwhile, some can't be cast until fortitude level 20, and those are the devastating ones. Nick and I already favor unique playstyles in any game we play, so we had a few bases covered with the builds we both ended up making. Nick stuck with water and fire for stealth and speed, I went with wood and metal for poison damage over time and heavy lightning damage. And another really cool thing about the magic was the rock, paper, scissors aspect to the elements. Each one has a polar opposite and has the ability to straight up override its opposite element. For example, my poison shut down any enemy using lightning, so my spell that throws down a pool of poison was like a shield anytime we fought any enemy with lightning attacks. Like this bird thing, I could set up my poison pool underneath it and pretty much neuter any kind of lightning attack he would want to throw at us. And of course, Nick had his elements that covered others too. Weapon-wise, I don't think it makes much of a difference, honestly. Every weapon scales with a specific virtue, so it's best to pick weapons that will power up with the stats you've been accumulating, but from what we played, the combos and special attacks are merely cosmetic. They obviously have their specifics and are different in their own ways, like of course a hammer is going to be slower and stronger than a sword, but we oftentimes just attacked, and I couldn't see much of a difference between our attacks. Nick liked the aesthetic of dual swords, and they scaled with water, so he used them. I'll use a bow staff in any game if you give me the chance, and they just so happen to scale with my wood stat, so I used them. The loot system where you find randomly generated items all over the damn place is back here, but it isn't as bad as it is in Neo. There is a lot of loot to come across, but I find that it's not as bad as it has been. Every big fortitude flag actually lets you sell off all of your equipment if you want to. It's super easy to go to the All tab and just check everything off to get rid of it. The blacksmith even has an option to turn unwanted items and weapons into upgrade materials. The blacksmith has a pretty robust weapon altering system too. You can take the percentage-based perks of one weapon and put it into another one. You can alter the appearance of any piece of armor or weapon to make it look like another one, and I appreciate options like this when you're constantly getting new weapons that might be statistically better, but they don't look cooler. Pretty early on, I found equipment that was ideal for keeping poison on the enemy and powering my pole and lightning moves, so the only thing I used the blacksmith for was upgrading the gear that already worked for me and changing my appearance when I found equipment that I thought looked cool. I didn't get super in-depth with it like other players surely do, but I appreciate that it's there. We had a lot of fun with combat. Finding out these synergies that worked best for how we both played and complemented each other was a lot of fun. I think our favorite parts of the game were just approaching the combat encounters. So there is somewhat of a stealth mechanic in Wo Long. If an enemy is unaware of you, you can walk behind them and get a stealth hit for a head start on the fight. Or even better, aerial stealth hits can be executed on unaware enemies for both players, allowing for some flawless encounters if everyone is on their A game. But we were both sorely missing a crouch or sneak button throughout the entire game. Having to tilt the analog stick a half distance was a little unsettling because you never know if you're about to accidentally run or if you're in the clear. It's just one of those minor gripes that was a constant annoyance, you know? But yeah, running through these levels and coming up on a group of enemies, stopping and strategizing on the most efficient way to take them all out was very engaging. It's kind of ridiculous just how stupid the enemies can be sometimes, like this general who can just watch his soldier die from an arrow to the face and not think anything is wrong is good for us because now his ass is grass, but it's just a little silly. The level design plays a big role in this, however. I wasn't a huge fan of either Neo game's levels. They were a little too flat for my liking with a lot of dead ends. But Wo Long does a great job of adding verticality to all of its locations. And it facilitates all these new layers by adding a glorious jump button. Exploration is a big plus for this game. Running around these levels as a duo is when the game is at its best.
Wait, bro, don't go up that ladder. Follow me.
Bro, you got the wall. That's... Oh, you fell. Oh no. Deku! I mean, Lady Nagant! We love discovering hidden paths, the extra mini fortitude flags, and making sure we search high and low, combing over every possible inch of these levels. But only for a time. One of the biggest complaints we both have of this game is it doesn't know when to wrap it up, therefore letting aspects that we thought really highly of in the beginning of our playthrough become annoyances the further we went. Traversing these levels and strategizing enemy encounters is a lot of fun, but the only things that change as we go from level to level is the environment. And I like the environments, I think this game has visuals down pat, but the enemy types don't change after you make it about halfway through. I think the newest enemy type we faced off with was this wolf pig thing towards the end. Really fun enemy to fight, but we started getting pretty sick of fighting the same 10 or so enemy types. We had seen them all by now, become familiar with their movesets, we had wiped the floor with them all a few times by now. The way I see it, if a game has nothing left to show you, it's time to start wrapping it up. I'd say we saw every enemy and every environmental hazard the game had around part 5 or 6, but the game had more locations and boss fights to give us, therefore we had a heaping handful of levels to play through to face off with these bosses and see these locations. For what it's worth though, the bosses were always really cool to see and fight. These were visually some of the more interesting monster designs I've seen in these games. Oh, that's sick!
Okay.
And the character fights that you can participate in were really cool to play with a friend. The sub-missions where there are 2 or 3 enemy lieutenants to fight in a small arena were so much fun. The AI would play smart and switch targets periodically, making it really fun to communicate and keep the other updated on our separate fights.
Get away!
He got bored of me and said, nah, f him, and sprinted towards you. There were only certain times where the difficulty was actually on par with what you'd expect from a Neo or a Dark Souls game. It could very well be the fact that we were in co-op mode, but a lot of these super impressive fights ended up being over within a few minutes because we just rushed down the boss. I mean, holy shit, Zhang Liang, the tutorial boss? I know I wasn't the only one who thought I would never beat this dude. He was such a crazy barrier to entry. I was getting worried about playing through this game, but then I saw people saying he was not representative of the game's difficulty as a whole, so I pushed through. And yeah, that ended up being the truth. But after that, the optional battle with Zhao Yun was amazing. I was hyping him up to Nick throughout the game because he was basically Dynasty Warriors' main character, so I was excited to see him in action. And that fight did not disappoint. And then there's this girl. So in some missions you're given an AI companion, and they usually amount to jack and shit. They can't even revive you, they'll just watch you bleed out. And this lady is your companion for a good chunk of missions, and she never shuts up. We were so sick of her talking non-stop, so when we had an optional mission to duel her, I'd bet you could imagine our excitement.
Oh,
We get to kill her? Oh, hell yes. Dong Chuo was pretty tough, but we got him after a few tries, easily though. The hardest boss in the game was Lu Bu. This dude had so much health, so much mobility, and does so much damage that we had to put it down after staying up until midnight one night. We were getting so close, but it was legitimately a tough fight. Certainly one to remember, although I can't help but think it would have been a lot easier if this game performed like it was supposed to. Oh my god, look at this shit. It's no wonder this fight took us so long to actually win. We couldn't keep track of this dude's unstable Wi-Fi abilities. We came back to it after finishing some other side missions and schooled him on our first try, but good god. And the poor optimization didn't stop there. This almost broke us at several points while playing through this thing. And even before starting the damn game, Nick encountered a bug that wouldn't let him load into the first cutscene, so we had to wait a week before we could actually start our playthrough proper. That's why this video's a little late, by the way, sorry about that. And even after getting him in the game finally, a lot of levels are not optimized well for PC. This level with the demonic Chi Dragon was the absolute worst one. There's a thick haze as well as embers flying around. It makes the moments where you have to hop between these wooden structures next to impossible due to the slideshow performance. And this is made even worse by the dragon striking the player's locations with bolts of lightning that track you. But the crazy thing is, we played a submission that took place in the same level, but with none of those haze or ember effects, and it was smooth as butter. That really sucks too, because I bet these effects would have been really cool and enhanced the feel of these levels astronomically, if only we could actually appreciate them. There were only a few levels that ran consistently well in the entire game. Some submissions took place in the same environments as poorly optimized main missions, so it convinced me that the weather effects are to blame in just about every situation. But we were stuck wrestling with the game over flubbed inputs and bosses that like to blink around the battlefield without warning. That was probably the most frustrating thing this game made us deal with. It genuinely bummed us out that we couldn't experience this game at its height, because we did have a lot of fun. Making a team that covers each other's weaknesses was awesome. Exploring these layered vertical environments is very refreshing. Talking out strategies on how to best approach these enemy encounters introduced a whole new dimension to these missions. Still hate that there's no crouch button though, I won't let that one go. The game visually looks great a lot of the time. Seeing and fighting all these characters from a series I haven't played in years was a blast from the past. It relied a little too much on the power of family and friendship at times, but it was junk food for my inner child. Oh, and I would be remiss to not mention that Dong Zhuo was played by Mike Pollock, who voices Dr. Eggman, and Yuan Shao was voiced by Jason Griffith, who is just doing his Shadow the Hedgehog voice verbatim. If you and two friends want a solid co-op game to run through, I think you'd have a great time with Wolong Fallen Dynasty. The combat is great, the synergy your created characters can achieve is fulfilling, and the level design is some of Team Ninja's best. But I don't think this has convinced me to try Neo again. Sorry boys. I will catch you guys in a few weeks when I look at the Resident Evil 4 remake. I'm quite excited for that one. But anyway, I appreciate you for watching, so thanks for stopping by, and have a great day.